This is Book TV's Afterwards podcast. This week, Stanford University professor Jennifer Eberhardt talks about her book, Biased, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. She's interviewed by Democratic Congresswoman from Florida, Val Demings. This conversation is from March 2019.
Welcome to today's segment. I am Representative Val Demings from Florida, and I am honored to be here today with Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, who has done what I would consider some very fascinating work in the area of human behavior. But today we're going to talk about your latest book, which I love the title because I think it really conveys the areas that we really need to focus on, and it's entitled Biased.
Right.
Uncovering the hidden prejudice that shapes what we see, think, and do. So, Doctor, welcome. It's great to be with you today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
In your book, you talk about what I would say, I'll use the word, how we are conditioned, and I'll use that word, if you will, to respond to certain people and certain circumstances in a certain way.
Right.
And what you refer to as implicit bias. And you talk about how it can really show up in any profession. I spent 27 years as a law enforcement officer and had the honor of serving as the chief of police. So I'm particularly interested in how it can show up in that profession. But you clearly point out how implicit bias could show up in any profession.
Right.
So could you just take a moment to talk just a bit about your background, because I think it's so impressive. And then if you'll kind of explain to us what you mean by implicit bias, and how does implicit bias differ from what we all know and in many instances have experienced, just plain old racism.
Right. Sure. So I am a professor at Stanford University, and I study race and inequality. I've done a lot of work on racial bias in particular, a lot in the criminal justice space, but also in education, the workplace, in neighborhoods. I've done work looking at how race influences how people think about housing and how they evaluate homes. And yeah, it is something that you see everywhere. It's there's no real sort of area of life where it can't get under our skin and start to influence how we think and how we make decisions and how we act. And so that's what the book is about, trying to kind of follow that across all these different spaces to try to understand how people grapple with race. So you asked about how, definitions, right? So I guess we can start there.
Yeah, but it's kind of different. Implicit bias is not necessarily the product of racism.
Right. I mean,
not necessarily.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, to some extent, it's just a product of how our brains are wired, and so we're wired to categorize. We're wired to stereotype. We're wired to have beliefs about social groups that can get activated even without our awareness, and that's really what implicit bias is. It's our thoughts and our feelings about social groups that can influence our decision making and our actions even when we're not aware of it. So that's the definition, and which is different, right, from people who are burning crosses or evil people or bad people. So we're talking about sort of everyday people who, despite their intentions and despite their motivations, may actually exhibit a bias and allow that bias to actually infect the decisions they make.
So then you're saying implicit bias is not, it can affect all races,
yes,
all people, regardless of their socioeconomic status or,
yes,
necessarily who they are, whereas racism is more kind of deliberate,
yes,
learned behavior.
Yes.
Is that what?
Yes.
Yeah, and you talked about
it's deliberate, it's learned, it's conscious, it's, yeah. I mean, a lot of people talk about that as like old-fashioned racism.
Yeah.
But this implicit bias is something that you may not even know you have, something that you don't know is affecting how you're thinking even. And even if we know what the stereotypes are about various social groups, we don't always know that those stereotypes are influencing what we're doing, how we're treating someone, how we're evaluating someone.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned what you refer to in the book as the toxic association of categorization. Mm-hmm. And it was just it was kind of fascinating to me how you talked about how that influences what a person, how they see things, how they experience things, how they experience people.
Right.
But you also mentioned that our brains are wired to categorize people and things. Could you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Right. Well, we need to categorize in order to make sense of all of the stimuli that are out there in the world that are bombarding us, right? We have to figure out a way to organize it and to make it coherent so that we have some sense of, control, so that we have, a better idea about sort of what it is that's out there, so that we can make good decisions and we can, so it's almost like the brain can't handle everything that it's exposed to. And so there are these sort of techniques that our brains use to deal with all that information. So categorization is one of those things. And we don't just categorize people. We categorize animals, other animals. We categorize, furniture. We categorize plants, all sorts of things. But that categorization allows us to engage in the world, and the world becomes more coherent because of that categorization. But it's also it's something that we do with people, right? So it's not just plants and other animals. It's social groups, and when we categorize those social groups, we develop beliefs about people who are in that category. We develop feelings about people who are in that category, and those beliefs are called stereotypes, and then the feelings are called prejudice, and together that's called bias.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. You also You write about what you refer to as the cringe-worthy expression. As we're talking about categorization, the cringe-worthy expression of "they all look alike."
Yeah.
Now, as I sit here and think about that term, which I've certainly heard before, my first thought is to believe that anyone who would utilize that cringe-worthy expression of "they all look alike" must be a racist or a bigot. But you say that it can really be a function of biology and exposure.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, babies as young as 3 months of age already are showing a preference for faces of their own race. Wow. So it's something
at 3 months old.
Yeah, so it's something that starts early, and part of why that preference is shown has to do with what you're exposed to. So if you're exposed to faces only of your own race, and especially at a young age, that tends to happen. Especially in most homes are intra-racial, and so you kind of learn. Your brain is kind of tuned up on the faces of your own group. And because we live in segregated spaces, segregated neighborhoods, you don't come into contact as much with people of a different race. So your brain understands and sort of practices on processing faces of all of one type, and gets really good at that at the expense of really being able to process and recognize faces of other races. And so we kind of develop a diminished capacity to recognize those faces.
And so the phrase "they all look alike," how does that translate, if you will, into negative behavior or bias or racism or behavior that would hurt?
Right.
Because I certainly understand a baby at 3 months old, they start at an early age, we start associating with that which is most familiar to us, right? That's not a bad thing.
Right.
How does it become something that's bad or
Right.
lead to bad results? That kind of association.
Right. Well, it's a precursor for bias. Again, it's a fundamental thing. That's how our brains are built to categorize. But it's a precursor to bias because once you're placed in that category and you can't actually even distinguish one face from another in this category of outgroup members, then they become interchangeable. And once they become interchangeable, then the beliefs that we have about people like that can get applied to all the people right in that category. And so you go ahead.
You give, I think, a really good example, and I love the way you use examples in the book to really drive the point home.
Right.
Because it's very scientific, and you never even think about unconscious bias having a scientific or a biological kind of beginning or origin.
Right.
But I think you use examples very well in the book, and you talk about your work with the Oakland Police Department, but you also talk about a situation where there were a problem with robberies.
Right.
And that the victims of those robberies were unable to, no matter how long they were with the suspects or, what they were exposed to, they were just totally unable to identify the persons who robbed them, pick them out of a lineup, identify them at all.
Right.
So that's exactly what you're talking about terms of the they all look alike. Could you talk more about the work you've done with Oakland and that particular example?
Right. Yes. When I first got there, this was back in 2014. There was a series of strong arm robberies, and black teenagers were going into Chinatown in Oakland, and they were robbing middle-aged Chinese women. They would snatch their purses from their arms. And when the police tried to, look into the crimes and sort of get information about who was it and all of that, these middle-aged women couldn't tell the officers who it was. Like even when they had a chance to see the face, they clearly saw the face. Even when the police would go to them and sort of to ask questions about it and so forth, right after it happened, they couldn't tell you once that face disappeared who it was. So that was an issue. And when they asked these young black teenagers, well, why do you go there? Why are you sort of focused on Chinatown? And they said, well, we go there because they can't tell us apart. They can't tell the brothers apart. That's why we go. And so they knew that they could rob them at will and not be caught because these women couldn't ID them.
Wow. And even when I also read that there were certain training sessions that were done to try to help women like that or others to become better at recognizing their attackers. And what were the results of the training sessions?
They would say, pay attention to things that are distinctive. Like, did he have dreadlocks, or did he have short hair? Did he have a gold tooth, or, all kinds of things like that. But they would try to give them these strategies to help them, but they couldn't. They just couldn't do it. And
they couldn't get past the face.
They couldn't get past the face, even though they were motivated to. And that was because they hadn't had practice at recognizing those faces. They were being exposed to something that they didn't know really how to process. They didn't know how to recognize those faces. They didn't know how to read them. I had the same experience, actually, when I was young. I was 12 years old. I moved from an all-black neighborhood to an all-white neighborhood. Yeah. And, I was worried, as a little girl about how I would be accepted and so forth. And but the girls were so nice to me. They went out of their way to welcome me to the school and, invite me to things and so forth. And they knew I had problems, recognizing, like figuring out who was who, but they thought it had to do with the fact that I was new and I was just mixing up their names, but I actually could not remember their faces. I couldn't distinguish one face from another. And so obviously that really hindered my ability to make friends.
But I remember reading about that, and I thought it was, it was kind of surprising to me that this concept that you're talking about, quote, they all look alike, while we might associate it with racism, it really works both ways. And so you started yourself trying to come up with distinguishing marks or clothing, whatever, to remember. And these were not people you were afraid of or you feared in any way.
No.
These were your friends.
Yep. These were people I would sit with them and at lunch, and then the next day I'm trying to think, was that the person or was that the person? I mean, it was really hard. I thought, something was wrong with me. Like, why can't I do this basic thing that you think anybody could do? All of a sudden, I lost my ability to really distinguish one face from another. And it wasn't until years later that I recognized that had a name and that there was, a lot of scientific studies on this. And it's common. So we're talking about black, white here, and we were just talking about, black, Asian, but, it's all over the world. I mean, so it's with every group. So it's one of those things, it's, they call it the other race effect. So it's something that's common, but not insurmountable. So eventually, I was able to recognize the faces of
because
of
you
white
wanted
people.
to.
Well, not just because I wanted to, but because I was exposed to those faces over and over again. So as we moved to that neighborhood and I was exposed to those faces every day, and my brain just took a little time to catch up with my new environment, but it did catch up, and then I was able to recognize their faces.
But that was in a very welcoming
Yes.
environment, a very loving, if you will,
Yes.
environment where they were friendly to you, they were kind to you.
Yes.
That was your experience day in and day out.
Right.
But in an experience where that's not the case.
Right.
Where you may not know the other group.
Right.
Very well. You don't know their characteristics.
Right.
You don't understand the culture.
Right.
It could have a very different,
It
I would
can.
imagine, impact.
It can. Yeah.
Because you talked about the implicit bias can affect what you see, and then you base what you see on then what you do, your actions, your thoughts.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. That's
Yeah.
correct. That's exactly correct. Yeah.
Something else you talk about in your chapter, transition of bias. Mm-hmm. And you talk about how, and you mentioned a little bit with babies, but how children will pick up on the characteristics of their parents.
Yeah.
They will love you if their parents love you. They will accept you if their parents accept you, or they will shun you if their parents do.
Right.
But that's extended to friends and other people, co-workers,
Yes.
within our circles, that people will respond to you based on how people they know or respect treat you.
Exactly.
And I know there were studies done, with, we know the disparities oftentimes with African Americans and how they're viewed or
Yes.
perceived. And there was a study looking at African American actors
Yes.
and actresses.
Yes.
And the thought was, well, maybe if we portray them, if the women in Oakland, if their experience with young black males was always in a negative one.
Right.
Let's look at if we portray black actors and black actresses in a more positive way.
Right.
Let's show them on television as doctors
Yes.
and
Lawyers.
police officers
Right.
and lawyers
Right.
and, teachers.
Yep.
Then it may make a difference in how African Americans are perceived
Right.
in the communities
Right.
or in society. Did it make a difference? What were the results of those?
Yeah,
those
so
studies?
that study was a study conducted by several researchers at Tufts, and they were interested in sort of looking at black actors in these really powerful roles, and roles where you could sort of think that they are serving role models, right, and having a really positive effect on people who are watching those shows. And so the first thing they did was to, take these really popular shows, dramas like CSI and Grey's Anatomy and those kinds of shows. And what they did is they gave people really, like 10-second clips to look at of, the people in the scene. And they would cut out the person that the people in the scene was looking at. And either the person was a black actor or a white actor. And they simply asked, so they're showing, the images of these people looking at this person that you can't see, right? And they asked, well, do you think that they like this person? Or, they asked them to describe, how that they imagine that person is being evaluated by them. And the finding was when it was a black actor who was the target of these nonverbals, they were more negative nonverbal. That they were, it could be like a frown or maybe subtle things. I mean, when they asked them why it is that they thought, this person was being perceived more negatively, say, they couldn't tell you. So it's very, it's something that's subtle, but they were picking up on it. And so the finding basically was that, they thought that the actors were treating the unseen black character more negatively and that they were less liked than the unseen white character. And then the other thing about this was the how this is, how what they call, you get this bias contagion, because it wasn't just the people who were on the movie set, right, or the TV set. It was also the people who watched those shows. And so when you, look at people who are watching those shows, the finding is that when you're exposed to this negative behavior towards a black person, even though it's subtle, again, that actually increases your own implicit bias. So we're thinking sometimes, that, okay, this is the answer, but, the bias has a way of still sneaking in. So that study showed how that
I think it's pretty
place.
Amazing. So if you think about a person in any profession, if their exposure, as we've already talked about, has been just negative.
Yeah.
And then, but even in a very controlled situation with African Americans playing very positive roles, you talked about how those who were watching the footage picked out very, what I would consider minor flaws, if you will, maybe a frown on the face or a certain expression that appeared to have been really blown up, as opposed to really seeing that person solely as an African American who's playing a very positive role, doctor, police officer, teacher, or
Yeah. I mean, even young children pick up on this, like you said. They look to adults to figure out how other people are seen and how they should treat that person. There was a study on that as well with 4th and 5th graders who were shown a clip of someone who was being treated poorly or someone who was being treated well. And the 4th and 5th graders kind of took on the attitudes of the person who was treating that person well or treating that person negatively. And so they're watching what we do to figure out what they should do and how they should act and who deserves good treatment and who deserves bad treatment.
Wow. Dr. Eberhardt, I loved being a police officer. I did it for a lot of years, and you pointed out in your book that as we talk about some of the challenges with police community relations, you pointed out in your book that 99% of police encounters with citizens do not result in any use of force, but if certainly the ones that result in deadly force, we pay a lot of attention to, as we should. But police officers, it's a tough job, right? And it can be a very dangerous job. And so as we're talking about how people, whether consciously or unconsciously, are trying to decide what action are they going to take, certainly I would think those biases would certainly play a role in a job that's very dangerous. And many times, I think, as you pointed out, police officers many times feel like the community that they're trying to protect and serve may not protect and serve them. That they may not be on their side, which I can think might just exacerbate the biases that already may exist. You point out a couple of incidences that took place. One of them was Tamir Rice. And you talk about them, and also the Crutcher family as well, with Terrence. How do you believe, as you look at those situations, I know you watched video that was available in Terrence's, the unfortunate shooting that occurred with him. And you went to visit his sister and heard her story about her brother that she grew up with versus the person, her twin brother, that's absolutely correct, that she's been with since the beginning, since she took her first breath.
Yeah.
So I know you personally experienced the pain of that family because you met her and spent time with her.
Yes.
I know you reviewed video in his shooting. You spent time with his twin sister.
Right.
You also studied Tamir's shooting. How do you believe unconscious bias played a role in ultimately what happened in those cases?
So it's hard. I mean, as a social scientist, it's hard for me to say what happened in one particular case, right? Yeah. So I'm not, there, a member of the jury.
Answers, of course not.
Right. And so what I do is to try to, look at features of these kinds of cases, and then isolate those features and study them in a laboratory. So we don't know. Even when we find, say, that there's a correlation between race and some negative outcome, we don't know how much race is driving that in particular, or some other factors that are also correlating with race. Yeah, and so to do that, we can sort of take a situation and have the same situation. As a scientist, we can present people with a case, say, and we say, we want you to evaluate this situation. Now, it's the same situation, but we're going to change, for some of the study participants, they see it's a black person who's taking this action or the target of some action. For another group of subjects, it might be a white person who's taking this action or is the target of this action. And then we look at, that allows us to isolate race, right? And so now we can we're in a better position to make more causal statements about the role that race actually plays. Because I'm controlling everything. Yes, because in any one case, you can say, well, it could have been, because of the location where the car stopped, or it could have been or it could have been how he moved, or it could have been, there are lots of factors, right? And so we don't really know for one case, but so that's the value of science, is that you can step back and you can look at lots of cases and look at how people are responding, across the board, sort of more systematically. So I'll give you an example of some of the studies that have been done on this. There's actually a study that was conducted decades ago by a social psychologist named Bert Duncan. He was interested in how people read the body language of black versus white people. And so he had... He kind of staged this argument, right? So there was a study participant, and they thought they were watching an argument take place, right? And between a black person and a white person, and then the argument got heated, and one of them shoved the other. Right?
All staged.
Yeah. And so they had what we call different conditions, or, sort of a different setup for the study for various subjects or participants. And what they found was when the aggressor, the person who shoved the person, was white. So you have a white person, say, shoving a black person. About 17% of the people would rate that action by the white aggressor as violent. Now you have the same shove and you flip it. You have a black person shoving a white person. 75% of participants said that action is violent.
And I remember reading about that study, and when we talk about controlling the factors, the sizes were about the same, the action was the same, the really only difference was the race of the individual.
Right, and that's what you want to get to.
17% to 75%.
Right. They were more inclined to say that the white person, when he shoved a black person, was just fooling around. Like 42% of them said that. But when I think it was only about 6% of the people characterized the black person's, actions in that way. So when he shoves a white person, only 6% say that, that's just playing around. So it's huge difference. And you can see the difference of race, the difference that race makes there.
Now, how do you take that information that is clearly, there are no extenuating factors in that, because this is not a situation in a community or on the streets or in a neighborhood. This is a controlled situation that has been set up.
Right.
How do you take that what do you do with that information? If you were training, you were using that as a training tool for any group of individuals, how do you take that information?
Right.
What is it that you want the student, if you will, to understand about the scenario and then walk away with?
Well, you want them to understand how race can play a role here in how people respond and how they behave. And you're presenting them with a situation that is identical but for race. And so I think being able to do that, the power of that, people understand it. Like they get that, okay, well, it wasn't this thing or that thing or the other thing. It seemed to be race. And so then that causes them to pause and sort of think about how race might play a role in all of these other situations that maybe we hadn't thought about before.
Discussing races, I think, is still an issue in America that we still struggle with, right? In terms of having really open, honest discussions about it.
Yeah.
Do you, in a very controlled situation like that, do you hear denial still? Well, it wasn't race, even though that was really the only factor that was different. Do you still hear denials like, it wasn't race, it's the way he moved his hand or he lunged, or do you hear kind of denials?
Sometimes
still?
you do, and then sometimes those denials might be valid, and you have to go back and repeat the study and tighten it up, and and control for the movement precisely, and all of that. So sometimes that's good to hear, because it allows us as social scientists to approach the study of this with more rigor. But oftentimes, at some point, if you keep doing the studies and you use different, techniques and different people and all of this, and you get the same result, then you have to pause and think, well, maybe there is something here. The other thing I'll say about that is, part of why people might be resistant is because there's this sort of underlying feeling that you're calling them a racist. So this gets back to our earlier conversation about how we're even defining bias. So if accepting this work, if it means I have to think about myself as a bad person, then that's going to be hard for me to do, and so I'm going to be resistant to it, and maybe I'm not going to, I'm not going to be willing to accept that so easy, and so maybe that's part of it. And so if we understood that, even good people, can have bias, and it can, influence, how we're seeing things, then that's a different story. Then you can actually hear it, and maybe you can think about how this might play out in your own life, in your own discussions, and your own actions that you're taking.
Do you think that's probably the main reason that people are so fearful to discuss race? And you see it on both sides, right?
Yes,
you see it among the races, not just one. Is it fear that you're going to label them if they question anyway, or honestly and openly express their fears, or their beliefs, or how they were raised, or how they've been influenced, that they feel that they're going to be labeled? And when labeled in America, it's kind of tough to overcome.
It is. I mean, it's one of the worst things you could call a person, right? Is a racist, and they think that's what you're saying. If you point out, that they behave differently to this person versus that person, and you think it's based on race. I mean, people get really, upset about that. It's an affront to, sort of the character of the person, and all of that. So, I mean, I think what the science allows us to do is to kind of step back from all of that and to actually look at it without accusation, but we're looking at it to really understand how this is operating, how it's affecting us, with the goal of actually making things better, with the goal of understanding the conditions under which this is most likely to happen, so we can avoid those conditions.
Yeah.
So I think that's what one of the big values of science is that.
Yeah. In your opening chapter, you kind of start off talking about your work with police officers and your early training sessions when you first walked in, and the overwhelmingly welcoming reception. I know this group, right? I know this group. And so you walk in and arms are folded. And it's like, I don't have the problem. Maybe you do, lady, but I don't, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just stone face.
Stone faces. They're like, I'm going to resist everything you have to offer to me, because that's not, lady, I have a tough job and whatever, right?
Right.
Just kind of what you were, race is tough to talk about, right?
Yes.
I think we all, whether law enforcement, every profession, we want better relationships with the community. We want to be strong, safe communities, but race is tough.
Yes.
And but you use the story of your son.
Yeah.
When you all were on a plane.
Yes.
To break the ice.
I did.
Right?
I mean, I was like grabbing for everything. Like I was, trying demos and jokes.
I'm so proud you hung in there, because I know this group.
Well, I had to hang in there, because I couldn't just run
on
off
a
the
mission.
stage, even though I wanted to run off the stage. There was no way out, so I figured,
way out.
Yeah,
That's
I had to come up with something, right? And so I told a story about my son Everett, who was 5 years old at the time, and we were on the airplane, and he was looking around on the plane. He was so excited to be on a plane, and just up in the air and seeing the clouds, and he was checking it all out, and then he sees this guy, on the plane, and he says, "Hey, Mommy, that guy looks like Daddy." And I look at the guy, and I'm telling you, he didn't look anything at all like my husband, nothing at all like him. And I'm looking, and I look around, and I notice he was the only black guy on the plane. And I thought, okay, you're going to get the talk. So, right, this leads to our, the discussion that we had earlier, right? I'm thinking he thought all black people looked alike, right? And so I'm going to have a talk with him about that. And
then what he said next was chilling.
Before I could have that talk, he looked up and he says, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane."
That's your baby, 5 years old.
Yeah, he said that. And
Who's your son?
Yes.
The expert on all of this. I know he was a little young, but that's what he was thinking.
Yes, that's what he was thinking. And I just, it just was, I didn't want to hear that, obviously. What mother would want to hear that? And I looked at him and I said, "Why would you say that? Daddy wouldn't rob a plane." And he said, yeah, I know. And I said, "Well, why would you say that?"
Yeah.
And he looked at me, and I'm telling you, he had a really sad face. And he says, "I don't know why I said that.
Wow.
I don't know why I was thinking that."
And I think that answer, because we can learn so much from our children.
Yes, we can.
We really can, out of the mouths of babes.
Right.
I think the answer that he didn't know, I think that could be transferred to every profession.
Yes. Yeah.
They really don't know.
Right.
Because it's unconsciously.
Yes. Right.
We get there in an unconscious way.
Right.
I just think that his answer.
You didn't know where it came from.
In 5 short years.
Yeah. He knew something happened where he said that, but he didn't understand it.
Yeah.
And he knew that it was problematic just from how I responded.
Right.
Right. And that's a good point too when we're talking about how do you talk to your children about race. I didn't ignore it. I didn't pretend it didn't happen, even though I wished it hadn't happened.
Right.
I sat with him right then, and I had a discussion with him about race. I wanted him to reflect on his words and why he said it. I wanted him to ask himself, why am I thinking this? Why am I saying this? Right? I mean, and I feel like that's our role as parents to help our children with this.
And I think it was, because I'm not sure how I would have handled that. Probably not as well as you did, but I I think it was so important at that moment that you did not say, don't say that.
Right.
And end of discussion.
Right.
And we have a tendency to do that because that's the easier way to deal with tough subjects and tough situations. You didn't. You asked, why did you say it?
Yeah. I asked, why did you say it?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is not only don't say that, but children come to understand that you're not supposed to notice race, right? So they get from adults that the way to be a good person is to be colorblind. But a lot of the research on this suggests otherwise. Right?
Because we're not colorblind.
We're not. It's
we
hard
never
to be,
will be colorblind.
It's hard to be colorblind in a world where everything is associated with color from birth to death.
That's right.
And so if they see that, how can they be colorblind? And the issue is when you teach your children not to see color, you're also teaching them not to see discrimination. And that's a real problem.
And I think you're teaching them not to value who they are.
Yeah. You don't value that
their
color.
authentic selves.
Yeah.
Just ignore it, right?
Yes.
I mean, we don't want, because we don't have a colorblind society.
Yeah.
I think what we want is that my color does not matter to
Right.
you when you're making a decision about housing or education.
Right. Or my salary, or,
my job salary,
exactly.
or whether I'm hired or not.
Yes.
We don't want it to matter.
Yes.
So, I mean, that was just such a profound lesson.
Yes.
In that conversation with your son.
Yeah, I'll always remember it.
Yeah. You also talk about, in one of your police training sessions, that you were approached after one of your sessions by a young white male who had moved here from Germany, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
And he was talking about his own experiences while on patrol.
Right.
And how he is affected, if you will,
Yes.
by what he hears over and over and over again on his police radio. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, he was, so I've done trainings in lots of different places. And so just, I don't know, being on the ground and hearing these stories, you really, understand a lot more about what's happening in police community tension and sort of what officers are experiencing when they're on the street. And so I was, at one of these trainings long ago, and so this person came up to me. He was from Germany, and I think he'd only been in the States for a couple years. And he said that, he told me that he could feel his mind shifting. So when he came, he was just like to think about himself as being very open and friendly, and he would treat people as individuals. But then after being on patrol and hearing constantly male, black, over the dispatch, over the radio, the police radio, it started to work on him. And then he's starting to sort of think about, okay, so these are the people who are committing violent crime. These are the people I need to watch out for. And so then it became almost sort of instinctual, where he would see a black person and he'd be sort of watching them, right? And just really, checking them out and sort of making sure, where are his hands and all of this. And so he was noticing that he started treating every black person as though they were a suspect.
And his friends asked him what was wrong with him. What's going on with you?
Because he was acting in a way that was so unlike him. And so they called him on it. See, again, it's the reflection. I mean, it's the talking about it. We tend to want to not talk about it because we think that's safer and that's better. But it was they brought it to his attention and they forced him to reckon with it. Yeah. And he was was worried about it. He was like, wow, is this job is sort of taking this thing away from me. I mean, I used to think about myself as egalitarian and all of this, but I'm
great
not.
Guy.
Yeah.
But you talk about the association of blacks and using that scenario and criminality.
Yeah.
If that's your experience, if that's all you hear.
And that's all you see. And that's that's what you're forced you're forced to make that pairing, black with criminality, black crime, over and over again.
The only time you hear that blacks are being lifted up is in a criminal way. Yeah. The only time you're hearing there is no this person graduated from high school or got their doctorate, or that's not what they're constantly hearing.
Right. That's right.
They're constantly hearing there was a robbery, there was a burglary, there was a theft.
Right.
Male black.
Right. So these are the people who commit crime. These people are criminal. But the problem is I mean, most cities, I mean, you have a pretty tiny percentage of people who actually commit crime, even when you have racial disparities in who commits the crime.
That's very true.
But then you start to expand that to to the whole category. I mean, you're it starts to bleed over into how you are thinking about other people, other black people who have nothing to do with that criminal activity.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem, is when it starts to expand. And that, again, goes back to our earlier discussion, when we were talking about the middle-aged Chinese women in Chinatown.
Yeah.
When you can't, when they're interchangeable, you can't, distinguish one from another. And this is the category. The category can kind of take control of us, right? And then we start to treat people within that category in similar ways and associate them with them all, with this characteristic, in this case, criminality.
Yeah. And you talk about, or you write in your book about how race kind of plays a part in almost everything.
Yeah.
You talk about the unfair bail system and how people who have money, regardless of the crime they've committed, if they're granted bail, if they have money, they can get out.
Yeah.
But poor people cannot.
Right.
And they spend a lot of time in jail.
Right.
And overwhelmingly, the people who are spending the time in jail are usually people of color.
Right. And it affects their cases, because, the studies show that if you are detained, if you're in jail pre-trial, your case, ends up less favorable for you because, people, they're willing to, plead to things that, they didn't do, and they're willing to, they just want to be out of there.
The pre-bargaining process.
Yes,
as
the
opposed to
to
just being totally exonerated, if you will.
Right.
They're willing to take a plea bargain.
Right.
Just so they can get out of jail.
Right.
But, Doctor, talk about the long-term effects, though, of you might take that plea. You don't have the money to pay your bail.
Right.
So you take a plea bargain.
Right.
God bless public defenders because they're overworked and underpaid.
Right.
But they're trying to clear their cases, right?
They're overwhelmed.
And they're overwhelmed.
Yep.
And so you take the plea bargain.
Right.
For that moment. You're living in that moment. But talk about sometimes some of the long-term effects.
Yeah.
How that can follow you well beyond the day you're released.
Yes, it can. I mean, because it brands you. You have a criminal record now, and that follows you everywhere. And so you have this criminal record that could, affect, all kinds of things. Your, employment. Your ability to get student loans, your housing. It affects. It follows you, and even. There's research looking at, the price of a criminal record, and the finding for seeking employment, and the finding is, that it's a huge, difference there for people who have criminal records versus those who don't. Also, a difference there in terms of callbacks when you're going in for, an interview, or you submitting an application for a job. There's a difference by race as well.
But you also found something, though, even with when everybody had a criminal record, there was a difference in who, if there were calls back, who received those calls.
Right. So white people with criminal records are more likely to get a call back than black people with criminal records. And actually, in one study, the finding was that white people with criminal records got about the same number of callbacks as blacks with no criminal record. So it's both the criminal record and the race, that's operating there. And when you put the two together, it really compounds things and really could affect your life chances. And it also affects people who aren't even involved in that situation, right? So you've made a decision, say, to accept the plea bargain or whatever, and so now you were assigned this label, as as a criminal. You said you're guilty, right? So that affects, people, that affects how strongly people associate blacks with crime generally, because now you're evidence for this legitimate association between blackness and crime. And so you've traded your freedom, and it makes sense, in that circumstance, just thinking about your odds and all of that, to say, okay, I'm going to plead guilty. But every person who pleads guilty, it leads to people to see the race as guilty almost. It leads people to see blacks as criminal, and blacks are disproportionately, committing crimes. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you can see how this is a sort of system that's built up, this plea bargaining system that's actually affecting how we think. It's affecting, the public and their associations that they're making with black people.
Yeah. And so I believe there are 2 million people who are incarcerated, and about 700,000 of them are released annually. And, you have to think about then what.
Right.
And I know you've also done some work within the prison system.
Yes, yeah.
And could you talk a little bit, there's so many good things in here. Could you talk a little bit about the Prison University Project and some of your experiences with inmates, and really working with them to really prepare them for success in the future?
Right.
Why that's so important.
So this is, I was at San Quentin State Prison in California, Northern California, and I worked there as a volunteer there, I should say, as an instructor. So I taught classes there. And
another tough crowd, right?
That's funny. They weren't as tough as the police.
Oh, well,
I had to say that. They really appreciated me.
Yeah.
That's funny. But I got there, and I was worried, about being there. I hadn't taught in that kind of environment before, and didn't know how they would receive me or the information that I had to share. But it was an incredible experience, and there are people there who are really trying to turn their lives around, and they're trying to develop, and they're trying to learn, and they're thinking about education as a way to improve. And so as an educator, of course, I love that. And so actually it was just the opposite of being a tough crowd in a way. But when I started there, initially I was really nervous, and just little things would just set me off and make me, nervous. And so in the book, I was given the example of, anytime the student moved even a little bit, I'd be like, well, what's going on? Someone stood up and to go to the bathroom. And I didn't know, why is he standing up? And then he starts to, he's approaching me. And I'm like, what's going to happen?
Just trying to get to the door.
Yeah, I know. He was just trying to get to the door. But I mean, just my own bias.
But 9 out of 10 people, or 10 out of 10, probably under the circumstances would have reacted the way you did.
Well, yeah,
Doesn't make it. The person was just trying to go to the bathroom.
Right.
So,
the person was just trying to go to the bathroom, but it helps us to see, how we can carry biases. Yeah, because I was there to actually teach, but then, my bias was kind of getting in my way of that, at least initially. And I tell you, I was just nervous. I was like, I was looking for the guard kind of out the back window, and what's going to happen.
And you were happy the guards weren't in the class eventually because of the progress that you all were making together.
Because they would get, they would be more quiet, and just, we couldn't have just really sort of open, dynamic discussions with the guards sitting there. And so I went from wanting them to be there to not wanting them to stay away, really. But it was a real experience, and just, I don't know. I mean, it's an example of what we talked about at the beginning, that we all are vulnerable to bias, really. And, it's not sort of something that's just about being a bad person. It's just what I was exposed to, right? And sort of my understanding of who inmates were and what they were like. And a lot of that is, from, all this exposure. I hadn't been really spent that much time in a prison before. So a lot of that comes from, television and the movies and sort of, all our narratives about who these people are and sort of seeing them as inherently bad, right? And so I had to think about, well, why am I reacting that way?
Yeah. You also write about, of course, implicit bias versus explicit bias, and you reference Charlottesville, and the whole attitude there, which you spoke a little bit earlier about, racist attitudes and racist behavior being somewhat different. But you also mentioned how the federal government, sometimes I think there are unintended consequences, but you talk about how the problems that we face in this area are somehow compounded by legislation that's passed. It might be segregation of neighborhoods, of housing, of schools, other institutions, and how that just helps to compound the problem that we're discussing today. But Dr. Eberhardt, you say that if we're going to effectively deal with implicit bias, we've got to look in the mirror.
Yes.
That every individual has a responsibility, right? And so, in the time that we've had, we've talked about so many things, used so many examples of implicit bias. But how do we deal with it? What's really the answer?
Right.
What do we do? Where do we go from here if we're all going to get better when we take that look in the mirror? What are some things that you would suggest or recommend that we start doing, regardless of the professions that we're in, to be a better, fairer America, if you will?
Yeah, well, there are ways to manage it. There are a lot of studies on this by social psychologists kind of looking at this, like what are the conditions under which bias is most likely to be triggered, and then how do you manage that, and how do you be mindful of those situations so that you can sort of understand and you can slow things down. So that's one of the this is one of the areas where you're more likely to have bias get triggered is when you're having to make a decision really quickly, when you have to think fast. We kind of go on automatic pilot, and we're just kind of sort of basing our decisions and everything and how we're thinking on what we've, learned before or what seemed to be associated, with what before, so this is, you're not really being thoughtful about it. And so when you're in that situation, bias is more likely to get triggered and affect, our decisions and influence, our behavior. And so you want to slow things down. So that would be a remedy there. We're more likely to, have our biases emerge when we feel threatened, when we feel fearful. In some of these situations are situations that cops are in, right? Like if you're feeling threatened and fearful and you have to make a decision really quickly, you could be more vulnerable to racial bias in that situation than if you had time to sort of think it through. Before I got to Oakland, California, I'm working there with the police department on their reform efforts, and they changed their foot pursuit policy. So they were finding, that, there were a lot of people getting hurt or, and sometimes when there was a shooting, oftentimes it was associated with some foot chase. And so they changed the policy. So they didn't allow officers anymore to chase people into enclosed sort of dark spaces where you would lose sight of the person. They would say, rather than chasing the person into this situation, we want you to step back and set up a perimeter and call for backup. And so you have, sort of time and resources, and you slow it down, right, to work it out. And they found just changing that foot pursuit policy, they used to have 8 to 9 officer-involved shootings a year, and now they only have 8 officer-involved shootings. They've only had 8 in the last 5 years. Wow. So it's a huge difference, and not just the officer-involved shootings, but even people getting hurt, injuries. I think officer injuries went down by like 75% or something. But these are also the conditions, right, that with the former policy that would promote the bias, because you're afraid, it's dark, there's a ambiguous situation, you're in there with a person that is threatening, you're feeling fearful, you have to make a decision fast. Not a good recipe for the best decision making. So if you can, you want to step back and slow it down. And so that's an example of how we could think about the science getting applied to these real situations that obviously matter quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Eberhardt, I have so enjoyed our conversation, and just congratulations to you on the outstanding work that you're doing. And congratulations on your book, Biased, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. Subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also send us an email at podcasts@c-span.org.